Hello again, and welcome to one of my highlights of the week, Skeptics in the Pub online. I'm Cleo from Winchester Skeptics, one of the many people from Skeptics groups all over the country who got together last year to put on these amazing events. A few housekeeping points and reminders first. Our speaker will talk for about 45 minutes or so, then we'll have a break, followed by a Q&A. If you want to ask a question, please put it into the Slido link, which will be below this screen and in the chat. You can also upvote questions there that you're interested in hearing the answer to. If you want help with our running costs, the PayPal link will also be below and in the chat. So I reckon I've won the mug wars with my super skeptic mug. I'm sorry about this. I could pretend that the mending was pretending to be beautiful Japanese kintsugi, but sadly it's just badly applied Gorilla Glue. If you want a mug like this, but without the Gorilla Glue, just head over to our merch store, which will also be in the chat. And don't forget, we've got closed captions for anyone who finds them helpful. So, on to the main event. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Micheal De Barra. Micheal did his PhD at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine on cognitive adaptations to infection risk. His research is concerned with health and behaviour and often takes an evolutionary approach. In particular, he's examined how infectious disease shaped cognitive evolution, how our behaviour alters infection risk, and how maladaptive ideas about health and healing spread and persist. And to explore these questions, he's been to some wonderful places. He's conducted fieldwork on informal healthcare in Bangladesh and on hygiene in maternity wards in Zanzibar. He also conducts psychological experiments on UK participants. Recently, though, he's been examining the social and cognitive processes that drive over-treatment, the use of ineffective medical therapies. And it's on this topic that he's going to speak to us tonight. So it's time to give Micheal a very warm SitP-O welcome, please, for his talk, Why Patients Want Bad Medicine. Over to you, Micheal. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cleo. I'm delighted to have the chance to share some of my research and my ideas on this subject. Right, well, up till about 1900, the vast majority of medical treatments probably weren't benefiting the patients very much. Kind of pre-scientific medicine was, as far as I can see, pretty uniformly, bad for the people involved. There's obviously a few exceptions, but I think some anecdotes about some famous patients kind of help illustrate this. So we're going to start with George Washington, who you can see here on his sickbed. And he came back from a horse ride around his properties, feeling a bit sick, a bit feverish, and some problems with his throat. And this kind of progressively got worse over the next period. So doctors were introduced, and the treatments he got were pretty appalling. So first, a mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter, maybe not too bad, at least. But after that, a string was tied around his arm, and the doctor sliced into a vein and removed half a pint of blood from him. Now, trigger warning, there will be some more discussion of pretty gory treatments in this talk. But continuing, so this treatment that George Washington underwent was an extremely common treatment at the time. And so he had this half pint removed from his blood removed. There was no recovery. He had a hot poultice applied to his neck to try and draw out the infection. Besides kind of scalding and burning him a little bit, this had no beneficial effect. A poultice of a toxic fly called Spanish fly was then applied, and this blisters, causes blisters to emerge. Obviously enough, that didn't really benefit him hugely either. There was a second bleeding, and a pint of blood was drawn from him. They waited a few hours. He wasn't improving very much. So what did they do? They drew more blood. So there was 2 additional rounds of bloodletting. So by this time, modern historians estimate that about 2 liters or 2.3 liters of George Washington's blood had been removed. And at this point, the blood was becoming sort of thick. He was desperately dehydrated and suffering from blood loss. And then pretty soon after, he died. He died, after refusing actually one more bloodletting, saying that he wouldn't survive it. It's pretty tragic, but not entirely atypical for the kind of treatments that were available at the time. And you've got to remember, this was, a wealthy elite man who was receiving some of the best medical treatment available at the time. Okay, let's jump backwards in time a bit to Charles II, and this is in 1685. And Charles II suffered some kind of fit that, again, modern historians think maybe had to do with a kidney dysfunction. And once again, he was bled, this time through cupping and scarification. So that's when you can have little scratches or little cuts applied, and then a vacuum, and then through that vacuum you have a removal of blood. So on the first day of his illness, he was cupped and scarified, about 8 ounces of blood removed. Then he had emetics, purgatives, enemas, laxatives, a whole range of treatments, none of which were likely to have any positive effect on his condition. Again, he had that Spanish fly as well, this toxic chemical that comes from insects, right? Like George Washington, eventually he died, not before drinking the spirit draught made from the skull of a man who had died a violent death. He died about noon the next day. Right, so the sort of common people on the street probably didn't undergo such extreme treatments. They fortunately didn't have the resources to pay for this kind of medical care. But nonetheless, the kind of beneficial treatments that were available were probably pretty limited. So to some extent, you'll have to take my word for this. I'm not a medical historian and I can't really answer any detailed questions about medical history, but there's a wonderful book I would draw your attention to if you want to learn a bit more about the kind of track record of medicine by historian David Wotton, and you see the title here, Bad Medicine, Doctors Doing Harm Since Hippocrates. And it's his argument then that up to, say, 1900 or a little bit after, advent of antibiotics, sort of septic surgery, kind of those sort of advances, beneficial medical treatments were rare. So I think this kind of creates an interesting thought experiment. Imagine we're stepping through some sort of space, and you end up in some friendly society on planet Earth sometime before 1900. So should you listen to local medical advice if you fall ill after going through this portal? Well, on my reading of the medical history, I don't think so. You should just, hope for the best and politely refuse any treatment that's recommended. And you can kind of make an interesting contrast here with all the other advice, all the other problems you might have. If you needed to figure out how to, find food or process food or build shelter or create clothes or any number of other tasks, you would be best served by listening very, very carefully to what local people do in that environment. And I've just got some pictures here from the British Museum of Inuit technology, one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Right, with sub-zero temperatures, ferocious conditions, and people do an excellent job there of thriving in those conditions through these excellent technological innovations that have evolved in these areas. Right, but once again, if we move a little bit towards medicine, I think then doing what the locals do is suddenly not such a great idea. And to me, this is a really interesting intellectual problem then. Why is it that medicine seems a little bit different from other aspects of folk culture or traditional kind of tools and technologies? What makes it often an area where maladaptive or harmful traits tend to persist? And this is a research question I've been thinking about for a while. And in the remainder of this talk, what I'm going to do is explain or describe 4 different approaches I've had to this question. And these are more or less independent. There's not too much of a link between them. So, if you're not convinced or you get a bit lost or something, then, maybe you want to just wait and for the next mechanism and see if that's of greater interest. Okay, so these 4 processes, I think, help sustain bad medicine. Let's look at the first. People just get better, regression to the mean, and self-diseases. So when you're sick, people get sick hundreds of times over their lives, and with one or at least a small number of exceptions, you will recover from those illnesses. So we have a sophisticated immune system that is dedicated to repairing cell damage, to fighting infection, and to kind of dealing with various sort of problems that arise in our bodies. And this creates the phenomenon of self-limiting diseases, of diseases that just go away of their own accord. And this is an interesting feature of biology, which is maybe absent for like other kinds of technologies, where if something breaks, it doesn't just magically self recover. So our immune systems then create this possibility to mistake treatments. A treatment applied at a certain time will appear to work if your immune system helps you recover from that problem. There's also a more subtle phenomenon, which I've illustrated here with a map of the current temperature, and this is regression to the mean. And so it's been a pretty hot week in the UK at the moment. And if you had to predict, is next week going to be hotter or cooler than this week, then statistically, it's just likely to be less hot, right? And that's because any extreme event tends to be followed by a less extreme event, right? Extreme events are defined by their, rarity. So similar kind of processes happen in health. So anytime when you have a disease with fluctuating symptoms, for example, and you have a particular bad patch, then statistically, more than likely, the next week or the next day, your symptoms will probably be less extreme. And of course, people are more likely to seek out and use a treatment when their symptoms are particularly bad. So just because of regression to the mean, we can expect them to recover independent of that treatment over the next few days. So regression to the mean and your immune systems, they both just make people better at time 2 versus time 1. So that's a pretty kind of familiar idea, but I've explored this a little bit looking at what are sometimes called village doctors in Bangladesh. And these are informal medical practitioners that provide a huge amount of the primary care in Bangladesh and in many other South Asian countries. And you might think traditional medicine in Bangladesh, the kind of medicine that's accessed by people who have low income, who live in rural areas, is sort of traditional medicine of some kind. But often that does exist. But oftentimes people are accessing really very familiar pharmaceutical products via these kinds of doctors who work in small clinics that they set up. So these are pharmacies, come sort of GP surgeries, where you will go with your problem and you will get recommended some sort of treatment and sold that treatment. And because Bangladesh has a large pharmaceutical industry, you can get anything in these clinics. So antipsychotics, antidepressants, strong painkillers, antibiotics, all there available without a prescription from someone who has had very minimal training, or perhaps an apprenticeship with another similar practitioner for a few months, or maybe worked in some aspect of the healthcare system before they kind of branched out and set up a clinic like this. So there's very kind of interesting medical phenomena. But what I was interested in is kind of how these kind of patients see the outcomes, how these doctors see the outcomes of their patients over time. So what my field workers and I did was basically sit outside a bunch of these clinics and then interview patients as they were leaving, ask them about their symptoms, ask them about what kind of treatments they had been prescribed. And then what we did afterwards is followed them up by phoning them about a week to 10 days later. So we phoned about exactly 188 people up to 10 days later and asked them about their, how they got on. Were they feeling better or worse than they had when we'd seen them the first time round? And we asked them about their satisfaction with this encounter with a medical practitioner. We also had a medical doctor look through the symptom profiles and the prescribed drugs and make a kind of, somewhat of a guess, but an educated guess about how likely the treatment would be to have benefited them. Okay, and so what are the results? Well, by our reckoning, about half of the treatments received a treatment that might benefit them. So a whole lot of overtreatment happening here. And that's 50% of patients received at least one treatment that might benefit them. So if they're prescribed, 5 different drugs, which was pretty common, this is just a claim that one of those drugs could plausibly result in some benefit. And nonetheless, 90% of the patients were either satisfied or very satisfied with the treatment they received. And more interesting still, maybe, is that the treatment quality was completely independent of the satisfaction. So treatment and the satisfaction were just unrelated. But what really predicted satisfaction was improvement. So in the graph on the left here, I've kind of plotted improvement over the past week. So 1 is really bad, they got worse. 5 is really good, they got much better. And then what I plotted here is just the proportion of people who said they were very satisfied and the proportion of people who said they were very dissatisfied. And what you can see here is that when they had good improvement, about 5, they were very, very satisfied, and vice versa. And then if we look on the next plot, the one on the right, here I've got the proportion of the prescription that was appropriate. So the proportion of the prescription that might have helped the patients. And here you see that there's basically no relationship with satisfaction. So just as I mentioned in the last graph. Okay, so patients who have all of their proportion is appropriate are just as satisfied, dissatisfied as patients with less satisfaction. Okay, so there, what I think is happening, you have regression to the mean, you have self-limiting diseases. Some people are getting better. Everybody's attributing it to what happened beforehand. Okay, and that's really tough for the doctors, right? Because, they don't have formal training. They're talking to their patients. Their patients say, yeah, that really helped. That treatment you gave me. And these doctors are also getting kind of heavy pressure from drug reps who are coming around advocating the use of particular treatments. And, what you can see here is that, they just observe their patients, and they're members of the community. They kind of see beneficial effects of these treatments. So I expect this kind of process has been happening for quite a long time and making treatment seem good. Okay, so that ends that. Next kind of reason I think bad treatments are common is that successful stories spread further than failures. Okay, so this kind of research is motivated a little bit by, overhearing conversations of people describing a weight loss diet or some other treatment where they tried something and it just really solved their problem, right? They had some medical problem, they tried some intervention, and now they're doing really well. And I don't want to doubt the veracity of their claims about what happened to them. But what I find interesting is that sometimes these success stories seem to appear much more commonly than the kind of failure stories or the no effect stories where people just don't get much better or where they feel worse after a treatment. Right. So the kind of theory I wanted to think about was, do people with good outcomes after they try medical treatments tell more people than people who have bad outcomes? Right. And the way I reasoned about this was, well, it's hard to track those random conversations that you hear in the wild. But it is possible to see maybe how people kind of describe their outcomes of their treatments online. And in particular, Amazon reviews provide quite an interesting insight into people's experiences after treatment. So my kind of rationale here is that if you're more likely to tell your friends or tell your colleagues about how you got on after a treatment, that kind of enthusiasm to, share information about your experiences might also result in people being more likely to write a review of the product, right? So obviously these can only apply to medical products that are for sale on Amazon, but a lot of things fall into that category. So what I did then was, I'm just going to skip forward. What I did then is compare the outcomes of weight loss diets, first of all, that had been subjected to a clinical trial with outcomes that had been reported by people who wrote a review of the same diet, because these diets are often described in books, on Amazon. So this here, what you're looking at is a review of the Atkins diet. It's a really famous book. It describes a very low carbohydrate diet, very meat-based. And there's a lot of reviews of this book. And there's also been a lot of clinical trials investigating how effective this diet is. So what I did was read 1,359 reviews and about 696 mentioned a weight change. So you can see this particular review I've highlighted in blue. I've lost a total of 104 pounds, right? And they also mention a duration. So 587 mentioned a duration because we have when they wrote the review and when they started the diet. So there we can calculate a duration for this particular person, right? So that kind of gives me a data point because we have a duration and we have a weight loss. And then I can compare that data point to the kind of results you see in a clinical trial, or compare loads of those data points. And the prediction then, of course, is you'll see heavy overrepresentation of successful outcomes, in this case, large weight loss, in the Amazon reviews versus the clinical trials. Okay, so here's the clinical trials, 3 trials of the Atkins diet that I found, and they all show, a reasonable effect of this diet. Well, by some definition, reasonable anyway. People lost about 5 kilos over the first, 4 to 6 months. And then some of the trials showed a little bit of regain. And of course, these are average effects. So some people lost a lot more, some people lost less. But the kind of average effect was about a 5 kilo loss. And then we can look at the Amazon reviews. Okay, so here I'm plotting the average weight change at each kind of for the chunk of people who describe their weight change at each of these time points. So what you see is dramatically different a pattern of weight loss. And so what I think is happening here, happy to hear your comments later about this, is that people with the really positive experiences are just much more likely to share what happened to them. And they go online and they write the reviews, and they also tell their colleagues and so on. And that's fine. That they're not maybe misrepresenting their experiences, but the net effect of this is that if you're listening to the people around you or reading these reviews, you get this really distorted impression of what's happening. Just showing the same data in a slightly different way here, where I've got the distributions here in red for the Amazon reviews, and in the blue is the teal is the RCTs, and you can see at 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, this real difference between the Amazon reviews and the RCTs. Okay, so I looked, well, that's a book, does this apply to other treatments? I looked at Ali, a cholesterol treatment that's available on Amazon in the US. I think they sell this on Amazon. In the UK, you can't. But similar principle. Do we see a greater weight loss in the reviews versus in the clinical trials of this product? So there's been 2 clinical trials of orlistat. That's the Ali and orlistat are the same thing. And the 2 clinical trials, and then I had 250 reviews that mentioned a duration and did I say cholesterol? This is a weight change drug. Okay. Oh yeah, I'm mixing it up with another one. So this is the weight change drug. It inhibits the absorption of fats, supposedly anyway, into the blood, and that's how this works. Yes. So the 2 clinical trials here in blue, showing again about 5. Maybe 7 kilo weight change over the first year. See those 2 kind of blue lines? Those are the averages of the 2 trials, and then these red dots with a kind of line of best fit there. Those are the Amazon reviews. So again, much greater weight loss experienced in these Amazon reviewers versus in the clinical trials. Okay, don't want to go on about this too much. One more example, though, to show this is kind of a general pattern, is in orlistat, and these are cholesterol reducing drugs, and here I've got a review of loads of different papers that have examined these cholesterol reducing treatments. Each of these little each of these labels here is one trial, and then I have a dot, and the dot is bigger if there's more participants. And just looking at the Benecol here, the one on the top left, the Benecol cholesterol. So each of these is one trial. And then at the bottom, you can see Amazon, right? So the Amazon reduction is about like 47 milligrams per deciliter, whereas the trials showing considerably less cholesterol reduction. And that's the same for cholesterol, for LDL, and for this other product here, Cholestof, right, for cholesterol and LDL. Okay, so then this reporting bias. So when should we expect to see this? So when the kind of distribution of outcomes is wide, right? So when there's a kind of range of possible outcomes, and secondly, when there's a kind of correlation between the chance someone shares it and the goodness of the outcome, right? So if people are more likely to share information when they have a good outcome, we should expect to see this kind of bias or distortion in the reputation of the medical treatment. And of course, good outcomes need to remain hidden. Okay, so we can think back to that Bangladeshi case, or indeed a UK example. So in situations where you can hear about the kind of good cases and the bad cases can remain hidden, we might expect to see this sort of distortion. Any of you involved with, social science will be familiar with the file drawer problem. That's really been a major problem for psychology and indeed for medicine, where researchers run a load of different trials, run a load of different experiments, and then just publish some of the results, usually the results that are statistically significant. I just want to draw your attention here. It's the exact same process. So you have this range of outcomes. Some of them are kind of entering the sort of public domain or being visible, and some of them are disappearing. And the net effect of this is a big distortion, right? And this has been a nightmare to try and figure out in science, but I think it just happens much more broadly with medical treatments. Okay, how are we doing for time? Good. Right, so that's the kind of second process. And the third one I'd like to move on to is thinking a bit more about the psychology of how people think about treatments. And the idea here is people like to use intuitive treatments, right? They remember intuitive treatments, but intuitive treatments are often bad treatments. Biology is extremely, extremely complicated. And with some exceptions, what seems like intuitively should be a good solution to a problem often isn't. So I'm going to talk about a paper by Elena Mitton and colleagues that nicely illustrates this process. So what they did is what's called a transmission chain experiment. And if you know the children's game Telephone, you get the idea here. So what you do is give some information to a person, and then they retell or recount that information and pass it on to somebody else. And then that second person recounts it and passes it on to a third person, and so on. And then you kind of track how this information changes and evolves as it moves through this chain of people. And this kind of experiment can be really nice for exploring how people's kind of intuitions can modify the story and make it more memorable or something like that as it goes on. So what Mitton and colleagues did was started with a story about an Amazonian man who had a headache. And he was keen to go hunting, and there was various other facts about him. And he had cut his toe at some point, and then the next day he felt better, and then he went on about his day. So that was the initial story that they fed into this kind of transmission chain of participants. But what they saw after a few generations is that oftentimes the story changed such that it wasn't that he cut his toe and also he felt better. It was that he cut his toe and then because of that, he felt better. So you have this kind of causal bit that gets introduced such that the cut is causing the headache to kind of go away. And then furthermore, after a little while, after more generations, often the location of the cut moves to the forehead, right? So then at this point, you have someone with a headache who kind of undergoes some intervention. They have someone cut their head, and then that resolves this headache. Right, and this is kind of weird pattern of transitions. But what it really accords with is a cross-cultural pattern of using these kind of bloodletting-like treatments for a range of diseases. Both of the anecdotes I started with involve bloodletting, but it is by no means a treatment exclusive to Western medicine. And there's versions of it can be found all around the world. Sometimes it involves leeching or involve vacuum cupping, things like this. So what Mitton and colleagues argue is that we perhaps have an intuition that sometimes, like a disease, that there's a bad thing in us, and maybe some sort of malign, corrupt force or something. And then if we remove that bad thing, we will feel better. And that just kind of seems to make sense to people. And you can see in that story that got passed from person to person to person, a story that started quite differently ends up looking like that treatment after a few generations. And you kind of hear that fifth-hand story, and then you get a headache. And oh well, I heard about that guy who recovered after undergoing bloodletting. So this kind of intuition perhaps explains or helps us understand why you get the emergence and then the persistence of these kinds of treatments across the globe. And of course, these kind of continue today, right? Here's some, I think it's like 15th century monks on the top etching, and then Michael Phelps in a few Olympics ago, who was carrying on an august tradition of having his bad blood sucked out of him for medical benefit. Okay, lest you think this is kind of exclusive to, non-scientific medicine, I'd like to draw your attention to this example about stents. So stents are what you can see. They're little meshes that get put into blood vessels that have been clogged up. And the stent is expanded with this little balloon, and then the mesh sort of fixes open, and then it enables the blood to flow through this stent. And this prevents then a heart attack occurring because the blood can keep going, except that it often doesn't prevent heart attacks. So if people have had a heart attack, it does seem to be of some benefit. But there's a much broader set of patients who have angina, who have like chest pains that are a result of these restrictions in their blood vessels. And so studies have shown that these stents don't help people who have angina but not have had a heart attack in the past, right? And what the effects of these studies, at least for a long time, on cardiac surgeons was very minimal, right? Because it just makes so much sense that, you have a blood vessel that has a blockage, you put this in, it keeps the blood flowing. How can that not work, right? It's just so intuitive. So there was a real resistance from patients, from doctors, and to some degree from patients who kind of, thought this was a really great idea, to the kind of, de-implementation or removal of this treatment from the kind of repertoire of solutions for patients with angina. And this is probably pretty common across medicine. Once doctors and perhaps researchers have a kind of model of how the disease works, it can be difficult to remove treatments that connect to that model. So one thing I'm looking at the moment is colostrum. Those of you who've breastfed babies will be familiar with the colostrum is the milk that comes out in the first day or so after childbirth, and it's a little bit different from the milk that follows in the days afterwards, in that it's yellower, it's thicker, it's a little bit more viscous, and what you see across the world is a lot of suspicion about colostrum. So people think it's yellow, it looks a bit like sour milk goes off, nobody's breastfed for a while, maybe that milk's been there for a while. It just doesn't seem right. It seems like kind of bad milk. So people have this powerful intuition that this colostrum is a bad idea for infants, and as a result, sometimes no breastfeeding occurs for the first few days, or there's an attempt to express and then dispose of the colostrum before the true milk comes through. And this has a really marked impact on child mortality, sadly. So from day 2 to day 28, so the first month, children or newborns who don't get colostrum have about double the mortality rate. So that's pretty important. So you can see, I think what this illustrates is that, intuitive ideas with quite severe impacts on health can persist. So if you've got these different competing forces of survival and observations of health and things like that, these intuitions are really can be quite powerful. Okay, so that kind of finishes up my intuition section, and the next section is about the goal of medicine being to signal need rather than treat disease, and this is what I've been working on most recently. Okay, and again, a complete change of direction here, so doesn't really connect to the last one, so don't look for connections. Okay, so I like this painting illustrating someone who is on her sick bed, and she is being cared for by these two women, leading to her taking care of her needs in various ways. And taking kind of a Darwinian view of this, right, we can kind of think about this as sort of transfer of resources. So there's resources going from this sick person, going from these two carers towards this sick person. And often when people are sick, this is a tremendously important transfer of resources. Okay, sick people really, however bad medicine is, nursing is very, very good, right? If you're sick, having shelter, having, food and water, being relieved of your responsibilities, all these kinds of things are really, really important. And people without that kind of care don't do well. So mortality rates can be much higher. So this transfer of resources is often, a really good idea for these two women who are helping out. It's often in their strong interest to, with a little bit of help for a few days, might make the difference between this woman's life or death. Okay, and across cultures, you really see this kind of caregiving everywhere you look. So just one example of some nice studies of Ache hunter-gatherers in, I'm not sure what country, but anyway, in South America. And so the Ache are often sick, often injured, and what you see is that they often receive substantial amount of care from their kin, from non-kin as well. And one study had, I think, about half or more of people having a period of illness or injury that lasted more than a month. And so if it lasts more than a month without help, you're not going to survive that. Okay, so returning to our image, however, and taking a more kind of cynical Darwinian look at this. So there's this transfer of resources available to people who are ill, or at least who kind of request support from the people around them. But the problem is perhaps that it's not often exactly clear how much that help is needed. So illness deception of different kinds is really, really common across cultures. You can make distinctions between whether it's kind of an intentional attempt to kind of gain resources or whether it's not intentional or things like that. But there's a kind of cluster of terms which I'm going to collectively refer to as illness deception, right? So it might not be intentional, it might be, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to just call this illness deception. And illness deception is possible because the benefit to the person is opaque, right? So by that I mean many illnesses have few symptoms, and a lot of people with so very considerable need for care, don't look visibly sick, right? So whether they have, back issues or a whole range of possible sources. And then sometimes people with very obvious symptoms have very little need for care. They're perfectly able to execute their daily functions. So there's not that, there's some correlation between, how kind of sick people look or appear to be and how much need they have. But it's not a perfect correlation. So there's this uncertainty about how much care people need. And it seems like people sometimes exploit this ambiguity in order to gain this kind of care. And so, benign versions of this, we've all kind of pulled sickies, especially as children, and kind of access some kind of care support that's there and available to people who are ill. And studies on illness deception find that it's pretty common. So many people, if you just ask them, have you engaged in illness deception, will say yes. 72% of medical workers in one study. And if you ask experts, who of course might be wrong, but they surely have some expertise in this, would say that a good proportion of illness claims maybe involve some level of illness deception, whether that's a small exaggeration or outright deception. So returning to our picture then, our painting, so that raises the question, should these two people provide care? If they are uncertain about the veracity of Our Lady on the Sickbed's true need for care. And what I'd like to draw your attention to is this bowl coming in from the side. So let's imagine for a moment that bowl contains, as it may well have, some implement for bloodletting, or some bowl to vomit into once an emetic has been given. If that kind of treatment is available, then the prospective caregivers, these two women, could kind of use the patient's willingness to accept that treatment as an indicator about whether she's sick or not. So we can just think about this in a little toy model here and imagine two different situations. One, she's engaging in some kind of illness deception, or secondly, she's actually sick. And let's just imagine that there's some benefit to the care she'll receive from, being cared for. Now, if she's engaging in illness deception, we'd imagine some moderate benefit. She's released from whatever owner's responsibilities she has. But if she's actually sick, right, then the magnitude of the benefit could be much, much higher. It could be, life or death. So here, I'm putting it as 10 rather than 1. Okay. And let's then think about a treatment. So that treatment is some bloodletting. It's going to be unpleasant, and she will not enjoy it. So I'll put that as -2. And so the net effect then for the person undergoing illness deception might be negative, because the costs of the treatment outweigh any benefit to the care. Whereas for the person who is actually sick, the benefits of the treatment, the benefits of the care definitely outweigh the treatment. So 10 - 2 is 8. Right, so these numbers are obviously just made up just to illustrate this point. But what I want to highlight then is how the presence of a treatment can kind of act as a diagnostic test, right? If someone is willing to accept a treatment that has some cost, then that tells you perhaps something about the severity of their illness and the chance that they will, experience some dramatic benefit from that care that they receive. Okay. So I kind of explore this idea more in a paper that you can look at. It's open access if you like. But I'm going to move on to some experiments that I'm currently running on this. And in these experiments, what we have is participants read about a little vignette where their co-worker is a bit sick or seems sick, but you're not quite sure. There's some ambiguity. And then the participants either saw what's in green, what's in yellow, or what's in red. Just one of them, right? So if they were allocated to one condition, their co-worker was examined by a doctor and no medication was received. If they were allocated to the other condition, they were examined by a doctor and they were prescribed medication, which is helping with their stomach pain. And if they were allocated to the last condition, they were examined by a doctor and an endoscope, all right? A camera tube was pushed down their throat into the stomach and prescribed medication, which is helping with their stomach pain. So what we're trying to do here is create a situation. We're trying to kind of ask, are people more likely to provide care when someone undergoes some sort of unpleasant treatment? Right, because that's what this theory predicts. If medicine and medical treatment is having this kind of signaling role, then we can expect people to be more likely to provide care when someone gets a nasty treatment. So participants read one of these, and then they filled out this caregiving scale, right? Something we just created. So it asked questions like, my coworker is definitely ill, agree, disagree. It's fair to take over their responsibilities, and so on and so forth, right? And then we looked at the effects of these interventions on people's caregiving responses. And we don't need to worry about that. But the important bit here is the treatment versus the no treatment, right? So when the treatment was present, there were about 0.4 units, right, which is about I'll show you in the next slide. 0.4 units are more likely to provide care. And if the coworker received a painful treatment, they were still more likely to receive care. So about 0.7. Okay, and so just to illustrate what that means, so if they got no treatment and someone's responses were about like this, and then if they got the painful treatment, it would move to like that, right? So it's moving from sort of disagree up to agree, neither agree nor disagree. Okay. Okay, so I better finish up quite quickly, but just to say one or two more things. We, in subsequent studies, have found that treatments for mental health problems that the NHS recommends, like exercise, therapy, self-help, have very little signalling value relative to pharmacological treatments, right? Which is sort of sad, right? So when people are on antidepressants or things like this, people tend to take them more seriously or take their problem more seriously than when they're undergoing these other kinds of treatments. Similarly, antibiotics have more signaling value. By that I mean people take them more seriously if they undergo antibiotic treatment versus over-the-counter medications like paracetamol. There's also some really nice qualitative work where they have explored patients with back pain and their use of things like surgery in order to, really demonstrate the severity of their illness. So these are people whose illness doesn't really have a clear physical manifestation, at least not one visible from, afar. But this person felt like after each of his surgeries, he felt like his family, fellow police officers and doctors became more sympathetic as he contemplates yet another major surgical procedure. This latent function of surgery, social function of surgery, is a large part of the decision making, since the overall judgment about the surgeries is that they have made things worse. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Maybe we can talk about this in the Q&A if you like. But there's some really similar processes in biology that go under the title of costly signaling theory. But that's my kind of final point, that sometimes what these bad medicines might be doing is not treating disease exactly, but rather enabling people to have diseases that don't really manifest so clearly to kind of demonstrate the severity of their problem and that they do indeed need kind of social support and material support. So I'll just finish by thanking a few of my collaborators and funders and you for listening.
Wow, thank you so much for that. That was really fascinating, and moved into an area that really sounds really quite new, and not something I certainly knew very much about. I really enjoyed that, and I think looking at the Twitch and how quiet the questions have been, I think everyone was so busy listening that they were too busy to chat or post questions. Hopefully we'll get a lot more in the during the break. So that's just a reminder to everyone, head over to Slido and you can post your questions now, because Micheal's going to stop for a break. Next week, we've got Dr. Alice Howarth, one of our own, and she's going to be talking to us about cancer treatments. Are we there yet? And now we're going to move into the break. Do hang around for the Q&A. It's sitp.online/ask if you've not found it yet. And we will see you at 8:05. Thank you. I hope you've all refreshed your glasses and done everything else you need to do in the break. Meanwhile, we have Micheal back to have a look at your questions, and we'll get straight into them. I think we need to deal with the pets issue first. And Skeptical fella here has asked, where are your cats, dogs? The important question is, please insert animal sidekick species here.
Yeah, so I do have 2 chickens, and I would have been delighted to introduce you to them all, but I'm visiting my parents at the moment, and they are in a chicken hotel for a week or 2. Maybe next time.
I just love that chicken hotels exist. Yeah, wonderful. Paul, aka Picticule, has asked, do you have any examples of bad medicine for mental illnesses, such as inappropriate drug prescriptions for depression?
Yeah. So this would be veering out of my lane a bit. As a research psychologist, not a clinical psychologist and not a psychiatrist. So the only thing I would say is that I have no doubt there are inappropriate drug prescriptions for depression. So I do some other research on the kind of quality of scientific evidence and the kind of problems in how trials are conducted and described, and some of that case studies I use in my teaching are about antidepressants and comparisons with other kinds of therapy. And the trials in these areas are sometimes really surprisingly poor. Or the meta-analysis that kind of combines those trials often have, the one I'm thinking of was looking at exercise versus depression, and really, really small numbers asking questions, really important questions for patients. So I bet there are, but I also, the more meaningful thing I can say is that I'm sure we're making a lot of mistakes in how we do our treatment because of big gaps in the clinical evidence that evaluates those kinds of treatments. But I'd encourage you to look maybe at the history of psychiatry. I'm sure would reveal a pretty unpleasant picture of what happened to patients with depression in the past.
I think Prozac might just be a bit better than insulin therapy, for example.
Yeah. There's certainly good treatments available. I hope. I hope people are getting them.
Laura asks, have you seen any examples of things you've covered in your talk related to the coronavirus pandemic?
That's interesting. Okay. So I think maybe compared to other health problems, not much in a way. In part because I think there's been a huge scientific effort into evaluating treatments, and a lot of the treatment for coronavirus has happened, in hospitals. There's been loads of trials run, people trying to work out what works. There was all this stuff about that bleach-related therapy in the States. So there's certainly bad medicine happening. I would be slow to kind of connect it to any of the kind of four processes I've described exactly. Because I guess you need to know the details of the case.
What do you think? So, what do you think about the fact we've seen that unfolding before our eyes? So, we've had hydroxychloroquine, and then that's been investigated, and then out of the blue came dexamethasone. Wow, it works, and it's the first time I think people have seen these kind of things happening in real life. I mean, do you think that's made a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well-conducted randomized controlled trials are just I think what turned around the picture of bad medicine that I kind of described at the beginning of my talk. And well-controlled, well-designed RCTs are have been implemented pretty quickly, answering the kind of questions about the therapies you mentioned. Sometimes, I think sometimes there was kind of sort of ropey correlational evidence used to kind of justify some of those therapies initially. But ultimately, we've just got better at testing these treatments and figuring out what works.
Igor says, Nalivai asks, are we as a society, have we got any better at not wanting bad medicines than, he says, anti-vax?
Yeah, better at not wanting bad medicines. Yeah. So, repeating the same point again, I think introducing RCTs has really helped weed out a lot of awful therapies. The bloodletting, the Spanish fly, all the things I was talking about. I think overtreatment remains really, really common, and it's often coming from the medical professionals. And there's big incentives to kind of bury particular scientific findings. Trials are often conducted poorly. Outcomes are switched, during a trial to make drugs look better than they are, and this results in a lot of overuse of therapies. So I think there's a huge demand still for bad medicine that comes both from the kind of processes I've described and also from the standard sort of slightly corrupting forces in scientific medicine. Anti-vax. Yeah. So there's one interesting paper looking at this kind of intuitions about bad things going into your body that I talked about in the part 3 of the talk. And their argument is that, well, anti-vax, the content of anti-vax kind of movements or arguments kind of varies a lot, but they often just draw on this intuition that if you got sick and recently someone put a thing into your body, then those two things are causally connected. And that's kind of a resonant idea that people find memorable and compelling. So there's a kind of slight uphill battle that we're fighting that will perhaps always exist with anti-vax, and that might in part come from the intuitions that that this is a dangerous thing to do. And typically it is a dangerous thing to do, to put weird things into you, but it's a good exception.
So related to that, Laura asks, can you give any other specific examples of current common medications or treatments in the UK that aren't really useful?
Yeah. I think cough mixture for children is not a good, well, not a terrible idea or anything, but I don't think it has any effect. I think so Tiger Balm and Deep Heat and those kinds of things, as far as I know, they have no effect on pain. But they have this kind of fast, that you can feel them working, so to speak. Another example of this I really like is mouthwash. And now I'm not saying mouthwash doesn't work, but the acidic sting that mouthwash gives. So that is not connected to its therapeutic action, right? So they kind of add the sting to the mouthwash in order to give this sensation of being cleansed, right? So you can see, that and the deep heat. They, people kind of find this sensation of something happening to them very compelling. And I say that's a thing that applies to some of the bloodletting and some of the other examples too, where I kind of see some consequence of the treatment, and it might not affect the kind of long-term thing that you really care about, right? Your health, the chance you die, but in the short term, you have noticed something has changed, and that maybe is reassuring. Specific examples of current medications, I'm not going to think of any others, I think, but there is a lot of work in medical research now on trying to figure out what kind of low-value medical therapies exist and perhaps save a whole lot of money by not applying them so much.
And I'm just thinking about some of these low-value things and the transactional nature of giving something to somebody.
Yeah.
So particularly the GP, if he can give you something, then she'll feel better about it. That's quite a big thing to have to fight, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. And if I'm right about this idea that the signaling value of the treatment is important, then the fact that that person can come home and say to their other half or their employer, yeah, I went to the doctor and he or she gave me this, that kind of verifies you in some way, kind of shows that you have a legitimate problem that warranted treatment. And if you think about instead a situation where the doctor says, you are sick, but you don't need any treatment, and that's often the appropriate course of action, right? And then that person sort of perhaps leaves thinking, well, am I really that sick? They have to go to work and they say, well, I didn't get anything from the doctor, but I really am sick. And it's all a bit, limp. So I think that, as you say, that sort of demand for something to happen in the consultation is perhaps an important driver of kind of the overuse of medicines.
Skeptical fellow again asks, would your research outcomes suggest that signalling desire for care or attention are a significant part of the appeal of so-called alternative therapies?
Yeah, I think it might be the case. I think you would have to kind of look at it on a little bit of a case-by-case basis. Some alternative therapies are, reasonably kind of pleasant and not that, perhaps not the kind of thing that would really verify your illness to other people, but others are, acupuncture, you're getting things put into you. I think of kind of sports related therapies. I think sports, even elite sports, surprisingly, is a real a hothouse of bad therapies, things like ice baths, things like that, and those kinds of things might be sort of signaling your commitment, demonstrating that you're you're a committed athlete, that you're willing to get into this ice cold tub of water after training. That really shows that you're a committed team member or whatever it is. So I would say, yeah, definitely. I think it's going to be important for some alternative therapies, but you probably need to get into the specifics of each one.
And Igor Nalibai asks again, is there a difference between people wanting bad medicine and people refusing any medicine?
Yeah, I suppose it depends what you mean by is there different. There's is there a difference in like how we kind of try and understand those phenomena? And I think, yeah, you would kind of need to draw on different explanations. I'm
wondering if he's getting at people who've decided what they want and therefore they're going to refuse other stuff. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think refusing medicine is interesting in again, relating it to the kind of idea that medicines are signaling something about you. Perhaps people would be deterred from refusing treatment sometimes, even if they don't think it's great, because the fact that they're refusing treatment is might say something about them to the people around them.
Have you done any work on that? I mean, have you found that if someone's turned down what was recommended, that it reflects badly on them?
No, we haven't. But we have kind of looked at cases where people have, chosen to go above and beyond and use aversive therapies or different kind of treatments, and that seems to draw more care from the people around them than people who don't. But it would be interesting to look at treatment refusal in that light. Yeah.
So Parrot Lady here asks, it feels like people are more likely to want to talk about positive experiences with health, but negative experience with services or items. Any thoughts why?
Yeah. My only thought is that perhaps people are kind of inclined to talk, when something slightly unexpected happens, or when something kind of defies expectation, and is therefore kind of useful information to share with other people. So if I think about services or items, like if I, go to, a normal restaurant and, I'll, if I have a terrible experience, then that's going to be quite surprising, and it feels like a useful thing for other people to know. And then people might be more inclined to share that. So maybe if it's like, if it's like the difference between your expected outcome and your realized outcome, if that's what kind of drives people to share information, maybe people just broadly have like sort of poor expectations for medical treatments, and then things go well, and then okay, I'll tell everyone about my weight loss. But sort of reasonably positive expectations for a restaurant, and when things go badly, then they're keen to share. That's speculation. So.
All right. And a question on Amazon reviews about how do you establish honesty in Amazon reviews? Someone's anonymous here is saying that they found fake reviews were rife for men's underwear, for example.
It begs the question of how we do for men's underwear. But so we have thought about this a bit, and I actually have a slide on this. Maybe if I can show it for a second. I don't know if that's possible.
I think it is. It should be.
Is that okay? Perfect. Just let me go to the next one. So we thought about this a bit, and one thing we did was there are kind of services that sort of check the proportion of fake reviews on Amazon, and I conducted this study a few years ago now. So maybe things have moved on a bit, but so what they do is they kind of look for things that are suggestive of fake reviews, and I think that's like certain usernames that have very few other reviews, usernames that are the review content can be very, very similar across multiple reviews. So they have have built some system for calculating a guessed proportion of fake reviews, and I sort of implemented that, and it was quite low across the products I studied. I don't know how exactly that works though, so it's not completely reassuring. There was definitely some fake reviews in it, but they seemed more like sort of piss takes rather than, my cat's on the Atkins diet, it died. They're not. I hope it was a fake review. So rather than being like an attempt to change, a systematic attempt to really shift the distribution. So one thing we did was look at the distortion over time. So we had the Atkins reviews were spanned about a decade, I think. And so what I did was divide the reviews into different time periods with the kind of idea that if you kind of commission fake reviews, which you can't do, you kind of buy, 200 reviews of your product. And what happens is then that company or person will go and write 200 reviews or get them written. So you have this kind of rush of really positive reviews that happen over quite a short period. And so what I looked at is whether the reputation of the treatment of the Atkins diet, at least, was kind of stable over time. And what you see in this slide is there was very little kind of change. So if this distortion, right, that's the kind of difference between the expected weight loss according to the clinical trials and the reported weight loss in these reviews is due to a distortion, is due to fake reviews, then they must be doing this extremely consistently over like an 8 to 10 year period. And I think it's probably more plausible that this effect comes from the kind of biases that I've kind of described rather than that kind of fake review process. But it could well account for some of it, but I don't think it's the main explanation.
It does sound very complicated.
Okay. Yeah.
Anonymous again asks, I see people using alternative types of medicine when they can't access proper healthcare. This is a huge question. Do you believe this could actually harm recovery or have no effect?
Yeah. I guess maybe the useful distinction is between like medicine that's probably going to work and medicine that probably isn't going to work. And like reasonably few alternative medicines, if any, have had like demonstrated positive effects. I also think that the majority have not been shown to really harm patients, at least very often. There's certainly instances of patients being harmed. One concern that people often raise is that one would replace the other. So the use of alternative medicines would kind of deter people from accessing more conventional or evidence-based therapies. But the question, as you posed it, is like when people can't access evidence-based therapy. So in that case, I guess it's the most likely outcome would be no effect.
Just out of interest, if anybody is interested in finding out when harm does happen, there's a website called What's the Harm? I think it's what'stheharm.net. And that looks at alternative therapies and things that have gone wrong or problems they've caused. But as you say, that's often when they can or when they could have accessed something better. Yeah. So Gray the Earthling asks, is there a correlation between an illness having clear symptoms, so it's obvious when it's gone, and patients requesting useless treatment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a question I currently have an ethics application to study on under review. So what my plan is to look at specifically, I think, I have to look back on it. What I hope to do is look at people who have more or less difficulty in kind of soliciting care from the people around them, and to see if people who have more difficulty are more likely to kind of look for these sort of, not necessarily useless, but like aversive treatments in order to kind of, and then the prediction would be, those people who have difficulty finding care, like that guy in the who had the back pain that I read out, right? So those kind of people who have difficulty in getting the kind of care they need because people aren't recognizing the kind of the severity of their problem, they're more likely to look for these kinds of treatments. But I think the kind of question you asked would be a very, good research question too, right? And the prediction would be yes, that people who have less clear symptomology should have more to gain by looking for treatments that help demonstrate their need for care. And so this is kind of ongoing research. So just to add a little qualification, so these are the kind of things I have to look at over the next few years. But this is by no means like a done deal research-wise. So, but that's a kind of excellent direction to take it in.
Right. Well, we'll have to have you back and find out the next bit of the story.
I have to believe my. Yeah.
Chromium 52 next has asked, is there any connection between wanting bad medicine and questionable and any connection between wanting bad medicine and questionable or nonsense diagnoses? For instance, chronic Lyme disease. Lyme disease can cause fatigue, or electromagnetic hypersensitivity.
Yeah.
So odd diagnoses.
So I'm not a medical doctor, and I not going to comment on these kind of the kind of veracity or these kind of problems. So is there a connection between wanting bad medicine? So as far as yeah, but potentially yes, right. In particular, we kind of say that like if diseases have kind of fewer really obvious physical manifestations, then there might be a greater need to kind of demonstrate your illness through and your need through other means.
So I think
sorry,
Cleo, I think they're also getting at the idea that some diagnoses are just rubbish, like subluxations, chiropractic subluxations, or I've seen people tell me very seriously that they have chlamydia in their bloodstream, and that's the cause of their problems. That would be a cause of problems. But so these like nonsense. Do people who sort of buy into these nonsense diagnoses ask for more, or is that not something we know much about?
I don't know much about that, but it would be, if you have a pretty, we'll say, unusual model of how biology works, you would think that might lead to unusual solutions to the problem you have. I wouldn't be surprised. Connection there.
Thank you. That's a really nice way of putting it. And I love this next question. The Parrot Lady, again, has said, please tell us more about need signalling in birds and humans. We showed a picture of a baby bird.
The signaling literature has really, is inspired a bit by or originates with work on costly signaling, things like peacock's tails, whereby an individual bird or whatever it is can convey some sort of message to some other bird using these kind of displays. And the kind of problem is, when animals communicate, is that they can mislead each other. And so you can have communication about quality or something like that isn't entirely above board. And so that creates this communication problem. And what Zahavi, a biologist, proposed is that sometimes when you have a signal that is costly to produce, and really a signal that is so costly so if I want to signal my quality, right, if I produce some costly signal that would really just damage very, very significantly an individual with less quality, liver quality is, right? So if the kind of poor quality individual can't afford to produce that signal, but I can produce this kind of signal because I'm of some sort of higher quality, then you can kind of use this costly signal as a way to ensure the honesty of the communication. Maybe not ensure, but like, enhance it a little bit. So that's kind of one version of how the signaling works. I think a more analogous case to what I've described about the treatments comes from bird begging behavior. So the bird comes into the nest and has a decision to make about which chick to feed. And, a lot of the chicks, will want food, maybe irrespective of how full they are, because, they like their siblings, but they like themselves more. So they might request food kind of no matter how full they are, because they can always have a little bit more, even if the marginal benefit is very low. So what's been proposed is what the adult birds do is kind of let the chicks pay a cost in order to request food. And this cost is making that racket, the tweet, 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 right? So that's energetically costly. It attracts predators. It's a sort of a costly thing to do, to make all that noise. And so if you kind of impose this cost, you need to pay to ask for food. What happens then? Well, the bird that's pretty full might not be willing to pay that additional cost because it's pretty satiated. It's pretty full. It had the feed worms the last time round, but whereas the bird that is quite is less well nourished, that chick should be willing to pay that cost, right? So that creates this system where you kind of have much more honest communication. You just have the needy chicks requesting, right? And so that's quite similar to the medical case. If you think about caregivers only providing care if some cost has been provided. And what that does is creates much more, potentially anyway, creates more honesty in those requests for care.
And does that actually happen with chicks? Do they shut up when they're full?
Yes,
wow.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, and they pay this cost and yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a direct analogy, isn't it, really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anonymous again asks, is there more, I'm falling over my words here, is there more bad medicine in diseases which have a diagnosis by exclusion? And is it justified?
God, that's way beyond my, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm not a medical expert in that area. It's all interesting questions, but I'd have to do a lot of work to answer that.
Right. Non-pigeonholer here says, Ray, Our Lady on the Sickbed, has economics been involved at all when addressing folks' willingness or aversion to accepting care? So the rich people can afford to rest. They can afford to be ill.
Oh, yes. So economists have studied everything. I'm sure they've looked at this. So, yeah. So in our model, we kind of thought a bit about how costly it was to provide care, right? So imagine the two people who were providing the care to the sick person, and what we kind of asked was, we kind of looked at situations where providing care was quite costly or providing care was very, very cheap to them. Right, so you can think about that, just having lots of resources. And what we see is when providing care was pretty cheap and easy, then it sort of made sense for them to not really care too much about the kind of veracity of the claim. So in those situations, you might not see these kind of costly signals where people kind of verify their illnesses, because it doesn't really pay for the caregivers to be too discriminating when it's easy to care. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at, but that's...
Yeah, the economics of it sounds like it's another angle that you haven't actually...
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Yeah.
Yes, but obviously some people can afford to be sick and others less so. So, Grey the Earthling asks, are there different rates of demanding useless treatments in the USA? where medicine's more commercially advertised compared to in the UK where it's not?
I don't know, but I would guess so. I think in studies of overtreatment, the US tends to come out on top, I think. I would be surprised if that wasn't driven by commercial advertisements. You know, they're paying for these ads for the reason that they work. And I guess relating it to maybe the subjects of the talk, you kind of see a lot of the themes here. So you have these ads, they overrepresent success stories. They draw on intuitive models of how the disease work, very, very simple models. Sometimes, depression as a simple chemical imbalance, or I guess in the UK, you see these on shampoo ads, where there's a science bit and it's all really nice, where you kind of see how the hairs get fixed by the fancy chemicals, and that presumably is much more widespread and is influential. Yeah.
Magic. Who doesn't want magically healing split ends? Yeah. Peter H says your final model seems to draw parallels to Munchausen syndrome, or factitious disorder, where the signals for sympathy and support become pathological. Is anyone studying this? So they really are intentional. He's talking where they're really intentionally misleading.
Yeah. I think, so the parallels, I suppose, so the idea assumes there's some degree of illness deception kind of happening, and or at least requests for care that aren't really quite related to the underlying pathology. Is there people working on it? I think it's a pretty big issue in a lot of clinical medicine, is kind of thinking about patients who kind of have persistent problems that don't necessarily fit into the categories that doctors use. And I think there's a lot of research, presumably, trying to figure out what's going on, but I'm not very familiar with it.
I'm trying to understand this one. How does genuinely believed in illness in the absence of illness fit into signaling?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Because so the model we kind of developed of this, it just says people who stand a lot to gain from care will be willing perhaps to undergo treatment, even aversive treatment, if it enables access to that care. So it doesn't really matter from the perspective of the model, whether their illness is real or not. What it's really saying is, only people who really benefit a lot from the caregiving will be willing to undergo this treatment to access it. So you could imagine a situation where people are sort of believe themselves to be very sick and believe themselves to be severely in need of care and are willing to access to go to some lengths to access the care. And whatever the sort of underlying biology of that doesn't really matter in a sense. All it says is that their need is great, and where that need comes from, whether it's illness or some social factor, is a different question.
I'm just a couple more now. A really short one here from Eagle. What the hell do we do to fix this?
Okay. I think one kind of question that comes from thinking about the signaling, then one thing that's interesting is is it a good state of the world where we kind of removed all these perhaps even ineffective therapies if they're kind of providing something useful to people, right? So if someone can get some sort of treatment that they can come home with, that tells their employer and that tells their family and tells their friends that they're really sick, Is that necessarily a bad thing if that treatment isn't doing what you expect, like isn't necessarily doing a good thing on a biomedical level? So the kind of good solution here might not involve like eradicating all the bad medicines. That might lead to a kind of drop in welfare if it stripped people of some ability to, communicate their need in more in ways that other people, found convincing and clear. So that's one aspect of it. The other things, okay, to maybe answer your question more broadly, I think there's some interesting studies looking at how people demonstrating that people who learn about the principles of evidence-based medicine, who learn that people often get better of their own accord, and therefore you need controlled comparisons of a group who get an intervention versus a group who don't get an intervention, and you need to carefully watch what happens to them over time. It's not rocket science, right? And people sort of get the idea and often have a kind of more skeptical view of anecdotal evidence and can pretty, can kind of come on board with the importance of evidence-based medicine or CTs for answering questions about the value of medical treatments. So I think, there's maybe hope in that for solving some of these issues.
You're heading towards one of our favourite answers, which is more education.
Yes.
Yeah. And finally, I have found your whole talk and your answers to questions absolutely fascinating, and sort of it opens up another area beyond the kind of psychology and sociology of illness that we've learned about before. And I was wondering, what would you really like to study next?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So one thing that I am kind of studying next is folk medicine. So I've got a large data set of traditional cures that were connected in the 1930s in Ireland with tens of thousands of remedies that were collected by school children. So what my collaborators and I are doing is kind of looking at the kinds of treatments that are used for different illnesses and trying to see how things like the severity of the illness or whether the illness wavers, gets worse and then gets better, how these kind of characteristics of a disease can shape the kind of folk treatments that that sort of collect around these diseases. So that's kind of what I'm excited to do now.
We really will have to have you back. I really want to know the answers to some of these questions. But I think that's it now. We're going to have to wrap up. So thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed that. And from the feedback that I've been able to see, so has everybody else. It's been really, really good. It's time now, though, for me to thank tonight's behind-the-scenes crew, Matty and Malcolm, who've been doing the broadcast tech, and Kat, who has been my backup in case I fainted on the spot or had some other catastrophe. And Kat has also been helpfully managing all your Slido questions. If you want to carry on the chat, we're opening our pub, the Lock-ins Razor, on Zoom. If you want to join us without your video and audio until you feel more comfortable, that's absolutely fine. And there will be breakout rooms. It's basically in the pub. So thank you very much. One last final round of applause, please, real and virtual, for Micheal. We'll see you in the pub either see you in the pub tonight, or we'll see you next week for Dr. Alice talking about cancer cures. Thank you very much. And thank you, Micheal.